David Stroup. I am a senior lecturer of politics, specializing in China here at the University of Manchester. This is a joint event between the Manchester China Institute and the Manchester Museum. The Manchester China Institute is an institution founded by a generous gift from Dr. Li Kai-hung. Its goal is to promote academic exchange, knowledge production, and mutual understanding between China and the UK. And so, we are very glad to host a number of lovely events like this one today. The launch of Rian Thum, my colleague's new book. I would like to briefly, before we begin, just introduce Rian. Rian Thum is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Manchester, a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Nation. He is the author of The Sacred Roots of Uyghur History, winner of the Fairbank Prize for East Asian History from the American Historical Association, and the Shu Prize for East Asian Anthropology from the American Anthropological Association. And of course, he is also the author of today's book presentation, Islamic China and Asian History. So we're very pleased to welcome Rian Thum. If everybody would join me in just welcoming Rian. So Rian, thank you for coming and sharing this lovely new book with us. I really enjoyed getting to read it and getting to sort of dig deep into this amazing history that you've reconstructed. I think for the benefit of our audience here who may be coming to the idea of Islamic China for the first time, it might be important to start out with talking about why you want to write this book. What's important about Islamic China, as you phrase it? Why write a book on this subject, and what is the history, the sort of established wisdom that you are entering into about this subject?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for being willing to read through the whole book so carefully and give so generously of your time to host this. China has maybe somewhere around 25 million citizens who are Muslims, and the historiography of the history of history writing about them is pretty short. Really, in a Western language, you don't get any book-length history of Muslims in China until, I think it's 1978 is the first book in a Western language. There are no academic books about the history of Muslims in China itself until maybe the 1940s and 1950s, depending on where you draw the line on an academic book. So this is a pretty recent field, which is a bit surprising because there have been Muslims in China, born and raised in China, part of Chinese civilization for well over 1,000 years. And so there's still a lot to be understood about this topic. And I wanted to approach it in a slightly different way than it has been in the past. The topic is often approached as the question of Islam in China or Muslims in China, which leads to a boundaried approach. It means that most of the time the story ends when these Muslims cross the borders of China for whatever China is at the period you're studying. Now, there are major exceptions to this. Historians will usually follow a Chinese Muslim pilgrim who goes to Yemen, picks up some new books and brings them back to China. But there hasn't been as much attention to how Chinese Muslims sometimes leave China and establish totally new communities in the rest of the world. So when framing my topic, it's a difficult thing to do for this topic because the category of Islam is contested. There are a lot of Muslims who will say that the Ahmadis of Pakistan are not real Muslims, for example. The framing of China, the category of China is also contested. Does the Qing Empire, the last empire, count as China, even though it was ruled by Manchus who conquered a whole bunch of extra places like Mongolia and Tibet and put them into their empire? How do you write about this history when the categories are so unstable and contested? And what I settled on was to follow the history of people who considered themselves Chinese and considered themselves Muslims at the same time. And that means, yes, most of these subjects of the history are in what we would often recognize as China, but many of them are Muslims in Thailand or Chinese Muslims in what is now Saudi Arabia, and sort of letting their sense of who they are guide the boundaries of what gets written about in the book. Yeah.
One of the things I think is most compelling and interesting about this book is your commitment to showing the ordinariness of Muslims in China, talking about how usually this is phrased as something extraordinary or surprising, and your commitment is to show not only that it is not surprising, but that this is a quite ordinary and expected thing. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about why talking about ordinariness is so important for you.
Mm-hmm. If you have read about Muslims in China before, you very likely read something that was couched in a sort of, oh my goodness, can you believe there are Muslims in China? Which assumes that there is something about Islam which is especially at odds with or alien to China. Now, the history says otherwise, right? 1,400 years or something of Muslims being a part of Chinese civilization. I think it's in the 8th century that we first get a Muslim inhabitant of China who passes the imperial exam and becomes an imperial Chinese official. So there's this idea that one author in one of the very earliest English language books, academic books, there are missionary books in the 19th century and early 20th century, but one of the earliest academic authors actually said, are they really Muslims? Because how could a Chinese person be a Muslim? So there's this sense that there's a surprise. Now, if you are a Chinese Muslim born and raised in China, especially if you're born and raised in a majority Muslim village, there's nothing surprising to you about the fact that you exist. And so what I wanted to do was try to write an account of Chinese Muslims, taking that part of the Chinese Muslim perspective, which says, actually, a lot of the things that people from the outside see as extraordinary or exotic are just my everyday. And I wanted to try to capture what that looks like. What does history look like if we just assume that this is part of the everyday? I also inject that perspective sometimes when people, like someone on an airplane or a train asks me what I do, and then they ask enough questions, like, okay, I study the history of Muslims in China, and they say, oh, well, that's obscure. And usually I'm nice about it, but every once in a while, if I'm feeling a little spicy, I'll say, well, not to the 25 million Muslims in China, it's not obscure. Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess you're right.
One of the things that I think is really gratifying about the approach that you take about the sort of ordinariness is that it centers both, regular people and, lay believers in their ideas about what being a part of this community, both of Chineseness and Islamic faith, what those things were. The other thing that I think really is quite interesting is that it brings you to this different set of texts that is normally covered by the sort of canon of scholarship on Islam in China. And in particular, in the early parts of the book, in your introduction, you talk about the importance of these sort of texts in Arabic and Persian language, and also these texts that talk about the importance of everyday practice. And I wonder if you could tell us what we gain from looking at those kinds of sources rather than the more traditional, more philosophical Chinese texts that often make up the canon. So this is partly connected to that question of the ordinariness, as you note.
Historians, we tend to be attracted by the types of sources that are extraordinary, a text that represents a break from the past. We often want to explain change, and that has certainly been the case for the writing of the history of Muslims in China. And a lot of the historical sources that have received the most attention are actually things that most Chinese Muslims never read, or even today don't read. And so I wanted to explore what were the most common reading experiences that Chinese Muslims have. And that meant reading a lot of things that from the outside seem quite boring. So for example, just a compilation of different passages from the Quran. At this holiday, read these passages. At this holiday, read this. Or when you want to pray for rain, read this. Not the most exciting reading if you don't want to actually pray for rain, or if you're not at the Barat holiday, or glosses on legal compendia. What is the appropriate place to put your hands when you're praying, things like that. And then probably the biggest category would be educational texts. These very short, easy to read texts that were part of the foundational education for Muslim youth across China. And that connects to one of the other main goals of the book, which is to get away from focusing only on sources that are written in Chinese. A lot of the foundations of the scholarship on this come from early Western missionaries who thought that Muslims were a great group of people to convert to Christianity. Sorry, early Christian missionaries, Western Christian missionaries. Because they were close enough to Christianity, and there were other reasons they thought that might be the case. And so they started writing books about these communities. And the missionaries who went there, they learned Chinese, not Persian or Arabic, in order to prepare themselves. And they collected historical sources and they wrote catalogs of them. And one famous catalog lists 300 and something different Chinese Muslim books that were in circulation in the 1920s. And at the end of the introduction, it says, books written entirely in Arabic have been omitted. I think that author didn't know the difference, couldn't tell a Persian versus an Arabic text, so the Persian books are also omitted. If you wander around a Muslim majority part of China and go to antique dealers and look at the books they have from the 19th century, you'll find that about half of them are actually not written in Chinese. They're written in Persian and Arabic. And the reason for that is that primary school education in many parts of China for Muslims was carried out first in Persian. So your students, your children would be Chinese speakers, but their first learning how to read would happen, to read for comprehension, would happen in the Persian language. Now, why is that? If you want to learn the written Chinese of that period, you're not learning the same Chinese that's spoken. You're learning a very different grammar, where a lot of the words actually mean something different, and you have to memorize a character for every single word, so potentially thousands of characters. If you learn Persian, you learn an alphabet. Now, you have to learn a new grammar, but Persian grammar is pretty regular, pretty simple, and that may explain why that's part of the reason why Persian was a primary education tool. So the book gives a sense of some of these texts and what people were actually reading, and tries to bring this half of the source base that in most works on Islam in China is either ignored or only touched upon briefly. I should say, though, that in Japan there has been a lot of great scholarship on the Persian and Arabic texts. Tatsuya Nakanishi and Masumi Matsumoto have done some really important work. All in Japanese, though. So actually, Matsumoto-san has done some good English
work as well. Yeah. So I think this broad overview that we've just given of the book gives a sense of what you were trying to accomplish and what the importance of the sort of this work and its place in this sort of conversation about Islamic China. I want to give you an opportunity to explain a little bit about the way that you've written this book in terms of like the structure of the book, how it introduces its ideas, because I think it's quite novel, the way that you sort of introduce us to this world and the sort of figures and ideas that are central to your book. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I started the book, I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable with an academic norm in which, those of us in the humanities are expected to have have a strong focus on abstractions, on what's called theory, sort of epistemologies and philosophies of knowledge and all these debates, and it's useful, and I love that stuff, and it's important for connecting, for example, the history of Muslims in China to the history of colonialism in Peru or something like that. But I think for a lot of readers it's quite alienating, and can often give the sense that you've taken some theory from a French philosopher and just taken it as a kind of meat grinder and then put all of your data through it and grind it out, and now we have a Foucauldian version of this history. So I wanted to restrict myself to the abstractions and theory that the material, the history, the lives of the people I'm talking about actually generate, the questions that maybe they would have found a little bit familiar. And I wanted the reader, I kind of wanted to seduce some readers into caring about the theory who might not. And my technique for that, which I don't know if it works or not, is to start in chapter 1 with pretty much no theory, no abstraction. We start with the stories of people's lives. The book you could call it a collection of 20 biographies, really. And over there are 9 chapters, I think, and over the course of the book, these more abstract theoretical questions slowly emerge from the material, and it gets more and more theoretical toward the end. And the last chapter is almost entirely abstractions. So if you don't like the theory, you can just read chapters 1 through 7 and then set it down and be satisfied. But my hope is that once you've read all of these lives and have encountered the problems of how they constructed categories about themselves, you might be interested in how we can make some connection between the way we as outsiders make these categories and the way they make their categories, and how we can deal with that. And hopefully then, by the time you're done with chapter 7, you're ready for some explicit engagement with the more abstract questions that lie behind it.
Well, this is a good point of transition, because I thought we might start to talk about some of those figures who form the core of this story that you're telling. And one of the first people that you introduce in this book that I think sort of has a story that gets woven throughout the rest of it, represents a lot of the ideas and themes, is a character who is known variously as Malian or Nur al-Haq. Spoiler, they are the same person. That Rian sort of introduces in his his introductory chapters. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the life of this figure and sort of their representation of an Islamic identity that crosses boundaries, that is both within China and then exporting China and Chinese ideas out into the larger world and vice versa, right? Who is this person?
Okay, so actual spoiler alert, because I know this is being videoed. If you're watching this on video and you plan to read the book, you might want to fast forward or skip this, because there is a bit of a twist in the first chapter, which I'm going to ruin right now. And which you already ruined, actually.
Yeah.
No, I'm happy to talk about this. Malian Yuan is an interesting figure who has been written about a fair amount in Chinese by Chinese historians, although not that much, and is almost never discussed in the English language literature. He lives in Yunnan in the southwest at the end of the 19th century, dies in 1903. And when he is discussed, he is usually called one of the figures of something called the Han Kitab, which is a kind of ahistorical construction of category of books written in Chinese that use Confucian terminology. And so one of the first things that's interesting about him to me is he published a lot of books using the woodblock printing method. He published about 20 different books, most of them not written by him, some written by him, but he was very concerned with increasing the number of books available to Chinese Muslims. And when you look at those books, almost none of them are in Chinese. They're almost all in Persian and Arabic. And in fact, he was the first person to publish a book in Persian in China. So he's let's see, I don't want to take up too much time on him, but one of the fascinating things about him is that he makes the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he comes back. He tries, there has recently been a rebellion, and there was actually an Islamic state or kingdom, a sultanate in the region, and he comes back after the sultanate falls. And then he tries to rebuild the education system in the region. He's training students to become teachers. He's printing all of these books, which actually most of what he prints is not new. It's things that were in circulation in manuscript, but he wants them cheaper and more accessible. I think my favorite thing about him is that at the end of his life, he makes pilgrimage again to Mecca, or he sets out, and he doesn't make it. He ends up, for reasons that are unknown, settling in northern India. And when he arrives there, he starts doing what he did back in Yunnan, which is publishing books. And I think it says a lot that this man, who spent nearly his entire life in China, was able to just waltz into Kanpur, northern India, and be like, I got a book to publish. And the publishing industry there was like, yeah, this looks like the kind of thing that will sell here. You know, it tells you something about how connected the scholarly world of Muslims in China was with the scholarship outside of China, that his books would just fit right in, that he would be able to converse with the scholars in northern India because he knew Arabic and he knew Persian. And then interestingly, those books which he wrote in, he published 2 books in Arabic in northern India, which was common in northern India. Lots of books were published in Arabic in northern India. Those books then make it back to China, start to circulate there. They become a part of the curriculum for advanced students in China. And then when Chinese merchants establish an exile population in northern Thailand, they take these books published in India, which then had gone back to China, they take with them to Thailand. And if you go to Chiang Mai in Thailand today, there are 2 Chinese Muslim mosques, and you can find copies of Malian Yuan's Indian edition of his commentary on an anthology of legal opinions in Arabic. You can also find a copy of it that has been translated back into Chinese. So he's really just captures a lot of the interconnectedness of Chinese Muslims with Muslims outside of China.
I think one of the recurrent themes in the book is the discussion of these circuits and this connectedness. And as you've mentioned already, the book takes you to Thailand, it takes you to Taiwan, it takes you to India, it takes you to all of these places that are outside of China that are nonetheless sites of Islamic and Chinese interactions and Islamic Chinese thought. And I think that that's a really interesting way to sort of frame the sort of interactions that we see here, whereas you point out the literature often thinks of these as isolations. One of the things that this also allows you to do is to talk a lot about origins and particularly the idea of, where people who are both Chinese and Islamic, where do they come from, and what their identity is based in that conception of origin. This is a thing that I think lots of people who we both have talked to in our studies are very concerned with. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what it means to research origins, what it helps us to understand, and perhaps what a search for origins tends to obscure.
Okay. So origins and origin stories are a major theme in the book. If you pick up a book-length study of Muslims in China in English, there's a more than 50% chance that that book will start with a very common Chinese origin myth about the Muslims in China. And if I mention to people that I study Islam in China, they're interested enough to ask about it, they will often say, well, where did they come from? Or how did Islam get to China? And what they're really asking for is, when did Muslims or Islam first come to China? And the answer to that question is maybe the 8th century, maybe the 7th century. And I think it's a great question if you're interested in how things worked in the 8th or 7th century in Tang China or in the Islamic world in general. I think it's a problematic question, though, if you're asking that because you think it will help you understand what's happening now or what's happening in the 18th century or the 19th century. The idea is that the idea behind this question is that the default state of Islam and of China is separateness. That is the norm. If we look historically, the first Muslims to come to China likely did so within 2 or 3 generations of the Prophet Muhammad, which means that if we want to see an Islam that is not entangled with China, we've only got a little 50-year period right at the beginning that we have to look at. And then we have to set that next to 1,400 years of these two things being entangled. So if we try to understand Islamic China or Muslims in China by this kind of origin story, we are projecting this little short moment in the 7th century onto everything that happens after that. And it leads to, we can see expressions of this in state policy in China. Islam is officially considered by the Chinese government a foreign religion. Buddhism, which of course comes from India, not from China, is considered a Chinese religion. We can also see it in hate speech in China. There's a online culture community called Muslim disparagers in China. And one of their favorite things to say is that all of you Hui people, which means the Chinese Muslims, if you don't like things here, you should go back to Arabia where your ancestors came from. This of course should trouble us politically and ethically, but it's also an empirical problem because most of the Chinese-speaking Muslims in China are probably not the descendants of immigrants. They are probably, most of them, the descendants of people who were converted to Islam. And for those who are the descendants of immigrants, which is probably also a large number, they are probably not descendants from people who came from Arabia. They're probably descendants of the continued interaction across those 1,400 years. So people from Iran brought by the Mongols in the 13th century, people from South Asia coming in either overland through Eastern Turkestan or by sea, lots of people from Central Asia. So when we think about this simplified origin story, we're eliminating all of that interaction in the meantime and ignoring it. One funny way this plays out in current politics is that the Chinese government now has a policy of Chinifying or Sinicizing Islam. Islam should become more Chinese. And on the good end of their spectrum is forms of Islam that are very Chinesified. And on the bad side are forms that are too Arabian. Most of the Islamic forms in China don't have much roots in Arabia, aside from the ultimate, the Quran and things like that. So part of this policy of the Chinese government involves going around and removing domes and minarets from mosques. Thousands and thousands of mosques have had their domes and minarets removed because that is considered Arab architecture. If you look at these structures before they're destroyed, most of them look more like South Asian architecture. And so you can see the empirical, the factual distortions that the origin story creates coming together with the anti-Muslim repression. Sorry, this answer is going on a bit long, but you did also ask another part that I think I need to respond to, and I've suddenly forgotten what it was, so maybe.
Well, I think the question lends itself to this exploration of what is sort of origins to help us to understand, but also what some of it obscures. And one of the things that you point out in the book is that this conception of origins may have been different depending upon which people you were talking to, that while yes, there is this idea that the ultimate origin of Islam is in the Arabian Peninsula, lots of the figures that you identify in the book would have said our origin is receiving a holy text from a man in Yarkand in Xinjiang, or in India from a Sufi master in North India. So I'm curious as to what these more sort of varied sources of origin tell you about about the sort of the state of both our understanding of Islam in China, but also how we study Islamic China.
Great. Now I know what I wanted to say, which it's exactly that. So the tension that really interested me when I was writing this book is the fact that, okay, I've just made a pitch to you about how focusing on the origins can distort our understanding of what's happening in the present or in the Qing dynasty. But then when you look at what these communities were writing, they are focused on origins. I think a lot of the authors that I study would be pretty upset with me for saying what I just said in my, a couple of minutes ago. They would say, no, we love this story about the arrival from Arabia in the 7th century, and that's really where we came from. So part of what I explore in the book is how do we as scholars deal with the fact that an origin-focused, an attempt to understand the nature of something by where it came from is problematic. It's philosophically and empirically wrong, with the fact that the people we're trying to understand really treasured those origin stories and defined themselves through them. And rather than explain my tentative answers to that, you can read that final theoretical chapter. But I think you raise a very important part of this, which is that different groups of Muslims in China have very different senses of which origin stories matter. And one of the ways they set themselves off from each other, distinguish themselves from each other, is through which point of origin they attend to most. And one of the chapters in the book is just an introduction to, I think, 4 or 5 different communities' origin stories and how they think about their origins. And it's not, as you say, it's not always Arabia. It's often they're focused on something else, and sometimes they're focused on origins within China. So our community comes from a sheikh in this other province who our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather sheikh went and received a text from.
I think this also provides us a space to talk about this conversation that you have about this idea of syncretism, right? That scholars who have studied Islamic China, who have studied Muslim communities in China, have tended to phrase their analysis as there are Islamic practices, and then there are these Chinese practices that are somehow un-Islamic but have crept in, that are syncretistic. And a lot of your discussion is really, for a lack of a better word, politely attacking that concept. And I'm kind of curious if you could talk to us a little bit about why this matters to you and what your sort of thoughts on this subject are.
This is connected very directly to this origin question we've been discussing here. So syncretism is the idea that you have, say, a famous example would be Christianity and Manichaeism, this Persian religion, and Christianity takes from Manichaeism ideas of heaven and hell, and then brings them in, and then you would say, well, Christianity is a kind of syncretic religion. Then after a while, people see Christianity as a kind of a norm, and so when Christianity is practiced by people in some colonized zone where they turn their local gods into saints, Christian saints, oh, that's syncretism again. It turns out it's syncretism all the way down. There's no pure religion or culture that isn't made up of influences from others. And it's, I think, revealing that we only use this idea of a blending of, oh, this tradition is a blending of other things, when that tradition is disempowered. So Christianity has a lot of political power behind it. Islam has a lot of political power behind it. Now, there are Muslim majority states that defines themselves by Islam. And so you don't really you don't say, well, Islam is a syncretic religion because it mentions Jesus in the Quran or something like that. So it's only in disempowered groups that we tend to reach for this blending thing. And it does the same thing the origin story does. It says, Islam and Chinese culture are naturally separate things. And anytime we see, for example, Confucian ideas, Confucian philosophy being used to explain Islam, which there are some really lovely, fascinating texts from the 17th and 18th centuries that use Confucian philosophical ideas to explain Islam, or use Islam to improve Confucian philosophy in the eyes of the author. These have almost always been understood as an unnatural blending of two alien elements, and you know, sometimes it looked that way to the authors themselves, but in the end, by focusing on this idea of syncretism, what we're doing is we're taking every piece of evidence that would tell us, no, Islam and China aren't separate. They aren't essentially incompatible. There's a lot of evidence. A book by a Confucian Muslim is great evidence that these things are compatible, right? Well, what we do with it when we call it syncretism is we quarantine that. We say, well, that's not a real Chinese book, a fully authentic Chinese book, nor is it a fully Islamic book. It's compromised by its Chineseness. So let's make a new category so we can keep our pure Islam pure and our pure Chinese culture pure. This is syncretic. And the Chinese state, by the way, loves this idea. And the Islams that are seen as most acceptable to the Chinese state are the ones that are considered to be syncretic.
I think, this is such an interesting and vital conversation, because you're talking about sort of pushing back against this wisdom that there is something exceptional about Muslims in China, that it's unusual or not ordinary, and you're saying actually no, these things are not as separate as we have perceived, and they're not as unusual. These are things that we should consider ordinary. This also allows you at the end to kind of have this conversation across a broad tradition of studies in the field of China studies or ethnicity or religion in China about, who gets to call themselves Muslim, or who should we consider Muslim, who should we consider as a part of these communities, and talking about self-naming and self-application. What kind of power does that have? I wonder if you can sort of bring us closer to the end of our conversation by talking a little bit about that part of this story. How do we decide academically about self-application of a label like being a Muslim or being Chinese? What is that doing in your book, and why is it important?
Yeah, that final chapter, in that final chapter, I make a case for an approach to academic understanding of social categories, groups like ethnic groups or religious groups. An approach that's really common in anthropology is 100% dominant, which is using people's self-identification. Do you want to know who's a member of the Pathan ethnic group? Well, just ask them if they're a member, and if you don't test their language skills or something. It's self-ascription. And this has been attacked. This approach has been used by scholars to try to draw limits around, when we write about the history of Islam, where will we stop writing? Who's included in a book about the history of Islam and who's not? For example, there are some Muslims called Quranists who reject the Hadith and say the only reliable text is the Quran. There are some Muslims who believe in reincarnation. There are some Muslims who believe in extra prophets after the Prophet Muhammad, who are rejected by other Muslims. So how do those people get included in your history? And one way to do it is take this anthropological idea that anyone who says they're a Muslim from a scientific perspective, where we don't want to get involved in the theological debates. That's not my goal, at least. This is not a theology book. The only consistent way I see to judge it is those who genuinely consider themselves Muslims in one way or another are who count as Muslims. Now, this has been attacked by people who say this is nominal. It's insignificant because it's meaningless because there are people hypothetically, who've never even heard of the Prophet Muhammad, who could call themselves a Muslim. And then what are we doing? We're just writing the history of people who engage with this word, Muslim. And the case of Islam in China is really interesting for this because the Hui, the Chinese-speaking Muslims, mostly some of them speak Tibetan and other languages, but the Hui are one of the few Muslim groups in the world who, at least before the 20th century, did not name themselves with a word connected to the Arabic Muslim. They called themselves Hui Jiao Ren. They called their religion Qingzhen, which is not related to the word Islam. And I think this gives us, so do we count them? And in order to count them as self-identifying, we would have to say, well, they don't call themselves Muslims, but they call themselves a word which means the same as Muslim. Well, how do we know it means the same as Muslim? Because we can track historically that they encounter the message of Muslims and they say, oh, we don't have that word in our language, we're going to use this one. Okay, so now we have had to track things over time. And when you do that, you recognize that calling yourself a Muslim is not an empty thing. If you call yourself a Muslim in Saudi Arabia, the law will apply differently to you. If you call yourself a Muslim in 10th century Baghdad, you will pay less taxes. Calling yourself a Muslim comes with social responsibilities and social benefits. Not only that, no one calls himself a Muslim or a Hui Jiao Ren without encountering Muslims, without a history of transmission over time. So what you're doing when you track who call themselves Muslim is you're tracking the history of the spread of the idea that there is an Islam. And that history goes back to the Prophet Muhammad. So every single person who calls themselves a Muslim is connected to the Prophet Muhammad because they're not going to just make up these syllables without it. They have to be aware of that history in some way. Everyone will have a different history of that, but they have to be aware of some history that eventually we could track, hypothetically, through the generations back, and then they have to want to associate themselves with it. And so I think using self-identification as a way of, from an outside academic perspective, deciding who we're going to study as Muslims is in fact very meaningful, not an empty nominalism.
I want to try and draw us sort of to a close in our talk here. So Ryan, in our conversations often as colleagues, we've sort of talked about these sort of interplay of past and present. And I know even though you're a historian, you are very conscious about how your work has relevance to the present day. Also, for those of you who plan on reading this book, Ryan is a great writer who, in addition to his historiography, has these beautiful ethnographic passages that are really evocative of the places that he goes to in the book. So this really great description that make this, a pleasure to read as well as stimulating intellectually. But I thought we might return to this idea of the sort of importance of understanding the ordinariness of Islam in China, or the ordinariness of Muslims, in that sense that you were talking about, that we shouldn't be surprised that there are Islamic traditions in China, and talk about what that means in our contemporary context. We've hinted a couple of times already at the ways that these discourses influence policymaking by the Chinese state, or the way that societal conceptions of who contemporary Islamic communities in China, like Hui or Uyghurs, are. And I wonder if you could maybe close here on a discussion of what it means to us in the present day to be talking about Islamic China as a normal and expected thing.
So I think in a better world for the Muslims of China, they would be regarded in a way more similar to the Buddhists of China. Buddhism comes to China earlier by about, 700 years. It's there in 100 AD instead of 700 or 800. But Buddhism has come to be seen as a normal, everyday, unexciting thing in China. As long as it's Han Buddhism. Once it's Tibetan Buddhism, it gets a little more dicey. But I think Muslims have a claim to that ordinariness, by virtue of their being there and being a part of Chinese history, and there have been Muslim officials throughout Chinese history. But unfortunately, they're not seen that way. And not being seen that way, being seen as a foreign religion, it causes them to be seen by the state and by a lot of non-Muslim Chinese citizens as inherently a threat. Some of this is a very old, local, developed within China form of Islamophobia, which there have been different forms of it, but one that persisted throughout the 18th and 19th century was the idea of Muslims as fierce, as great warriors, based on some of the political history within China. Before that, they were more likely to be seen as scientists and astronomers and bearers of special knowledge. In some times and places, they're associated with the beef trade because the slaughter of cows was not permitted legally, except Muslims were kind of allowed. But the current understanding is that they are foreign, and there has been an adoption of a sort of American-style Islamophobia, which sees Muslims as inherently prone to violence, to political violence. And this has led to some of the really tragic state policies that we've seen over the last 10 years, which include, putting more than 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps, putting special birth control policies in place that have kept the Uyghur population growth at effectively zero, forced labor policies that involve a couple of million or more Uyghurs, the destruction of the Uyghur language, residential schools for Uyghur children where they are, to simplify things, raised as Han Chinese people. That's one of our main Muslim groups in China with about 11, 12 million people. The other group is the Hui, who tend to speak Chinese. And because of the association with foreignness that Islam has, the Uyghurs, by virtue of speaking another language and by often physically looking more like someone from Afghanistan or Central Asia, are seen as more foreign, and their Islam then is seen as more foreign and therefore more dangerous. But the Hui are also subjected to some, as you know, some very extensive repressive policies. And I should say David has done some amazing work documenting that. And I'll just sum it up in a few words. The closure of mosques is a big one. The removal of domes, the banning of Arabic language, religious education, and I'm sure you could add a lot more to that. This all is tied to this sense of Muslims as extraordinary, as exotic, and so it would be great if those officials could read this book and start to see things a bit more through the eyes of the authors that I profile in the book. Yeah.
Well, so it is such an important book. I think it really challenges us to rethink and re-examine, what we know about Islam in China, and it provides some really necessary discourses about, the inherent separateness or not of these traditions. It is provocative, it is well written, it is available for sale in the back, so please do make sure if you're interested to pick up a copy. I'm sure Ryan would be happy to put his name on it for you. But it was wonderful to have this conversation with you today. Everyone, I would hope you join me in thanking Ryan for this.